Hello, everybody. I'm Howie Hawkins. I was the Green Party and Socialist Party candidate for president in 2020. And this podcast, Green Socialist Notes, is about continuing to educate and advocate for the eco-socialist program that we ran on in 2020. So I thought today, being the last podcast of the year, would be a good time to do a brief review of the bad developments and the good developments in the last year and talk about what we should do now in the coming period. So starting with the bad developments, obviously Israel's US-backed genocide in Gaza and its wars of aggression in the region it comes to mind first of all as bad developments. I mean, just this week, Israel bombed hospitals, a car with journalists in it that was clearly labeled. And of course, they've expanded the war into Lebanon, Syria, Yemen, and Iran. And with Trump coming in, I think we got to watch out that Netanyahu is going to try to get Trump to go along with a real war against Iran. And so that is something we got to keep opposing, and it's going to be difficult. I mean, as I've pointed out many times, less than 10% of the members of the House and Senate want to condition arms to Israel based on its adherence to human rights requirements. That's U.S. law. The majority of Americans support it, but our government doesn't. And, you know, the problem of American politics is translating public opinion into public policy. And this is a clear example of where we're not able to do that. So there's a lot of work to do there. Another thing is that Russia's genocidal war against Ukraine continues, exemplified by the Christmas Day strikes on power and heating plants, by 78 ballistic missiles and 108 drones. And I said genocidal war. You got to remember that when Russia occupies an area, you can't speak Ukrainian. You got to take out Russian citizenship. And if you don't, you go through filtration, which means interrogation, and you're either put in prison or you're denied all social services. That's the best outcome. But worse could be torture, imprisonment, and sometimes death. And of course, Russia's been looting Ukrainian historical objects and just trying to suppress Ukrainian culture in the areas they occupy under the Geneva Convention on Genocide. That's genocide. And people got to realize that as well. The pictures are not as dramatic as from Gaza, obviously, but it's still, there have been some cities flattened, like Mariupol and Bakhmut and Avdiivka, and now Pokrovsk. And it continues. I mean, the Russians, they don't liberate people, they just leave a path of destruction. So it's a genocidal war. Now, the big issue right now is a lot of people have been provoked by Kremlin propaganda that when Biden gave Ukraine permission to use the ATACMS missiles, which are, they call them long range, they're really short range under international law, up to 190 kilometers or about 120 miles. And the permission's only for in the Kursk region where the Ukrainians have a foothold on Russian territory. And there are only 50 ATACMS. There was a New York Times report maybe yesterday that said, originally the Ukrainians were given 500, but they used them on Russian military targets in the occupied territories. And then when they finally got permission to strike military targets on Russian territory, which the Ukrainians wanted to do because they wanted to push back the ability of the air-launched glide bombs, which are big, 1,000 or 2,000 or more bombs that are devastating to civilian and military frontline areas. And since November 19th, when the first ones were used by Ukraine, along with some cruise missiles from Britain, they did push back the ability of the Russians to launch guide bombs, which so that Russians have launched less of them since then. But there have only been 31 of the ATACMS fired since November 19th. So they have about 20 left, according to this New York Times report. This is not going to start a nuclear war like the Kremlin propaganda says. In fact, when Russia launched that Oreshnik multiple reentry missile, which is supposed to be, a big advance in military missiles, the chief of the general staff of the armed forces of Russia, Valery Gerasimov, called the chairman of the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff, Charles Brown, to tell him that this Oreshnik missile firing was a test that had long been planned by the Russians. So, the Russians are telling the Americans, don't get worried. We're not really going to escalate, and totally undercuts Russian propaganda. But people that don't follow the news don't know that. And, I'm afraid the Green Party, at least leadership, is falling for that. The Green Party Steering Committee approved a proposal from Jill Stein that they sponsor a conference and then maybe actions linking Palestine solidarity to stopping the shooting of ATACMS into Russia, because it will start a nuclear war. It's not going to happen. This is just not going to take off. If, we want to fight the new nuclear arms race, which I think we should, we can raise demands like demanding that the U.S. adopt a policy of no first use of nuclear weapons, that we unilaterally disarm some of the nuclear platforms that just make us targets, like our land-based missiles. And we don't need the air-based missiles, because the submarine-launched missiles are sufficient as a deterrent. So there are initiatives we could take, and that could possibly open the door to getting the U.S., Russia, and China to the table to start negotiating arms reductions with the goal of complete nuclear disarmament. Where we are now is the U.S. started modernizing, Russia's modernizing, and China is radically increasing the number of nuclear weapons they have, because they're afraid of both the U.S. and Russia. So we're in a bad situation. There are nuclear actions we could take, but focusing on these ATACMS is, I think, barking up the wrong tree. So that's another thing. Israel, Ukraine. And then another bad development is the success and growth of the far right from Europe to America. And European leftists who I was talking to in October and November and December, they view Trump's victory as a victory for the global far right, led by Putin's authoritarian, patriarchal petrostate in Russia. And then we got Elon Musk, the world's richest man, who's in the Trump inner circle, and the vice president-elect, J.D. Vance, endorsing Germany's neo-Nazi Alternative for Deutschland, Alternative for Germany, which has been gaining in the elections and represents a growth of the far right that is racist, anti-immigrant, and not a friend of working people, to say the least. But they are feeling ascendant. And let's remember that around Musk, and which means around Trump, you've got these racist right-wing MAGA billionaire tech bros who had their formative experiences in apartheid South Africa. Not just Musk, but Peter Thiel and David Sachs as well. The PayPal guys who became billionaires because of that. And then you got Paul Ferber, who's a South African right-winger, who is believed to be the inventor of the QAnon conspiracy hoax. So these are the people that are in the leadership and influencing positions around the Trump administration and the far right. And then look at Trump's administration, 9 billionaires for administrative positions, cabinet positions mainly, already. So the billionaire class has not only bought the government, as they always do, now they are the government. And they are hard right reactionaries. So the growth of the far right is another concern. When I was at the conference of the Federation, the European Green Federation, that was their main theme, is how do we fight the rise of the far right? How do we build an anti-fascist movement? What does the Green Party need to do in terms of its approach to people to eat into the drifting of middle class and working class people to the far right? Because the far right is scapegoating immigrants who are seen as competitors and fomenters or practitioners of crime, which really isn't true. But it's motivating people, because the left in Germany and other European countries is, while the right punches down, the left doesn't punch up at the billionaires, who are the real culprits in in the growing inequality and economic precarity of working people. So that's what the Greens are talking about. And so that's a big problem we've got to face. And then I think the fourth bad outcome or bad development I want to talk about is Trump. He got away with his crimes: sexual harassment, stealing classified documents, election meddling, and an attempted coup. And all those cases, he's not going to face any consequences, possibly for the sexual harassment, which he won't have to face the consequences of until he finishes his term in office as president. That one may be postponed. The rest are off the table now that he's got control of the Justice Department and can influence, like in Georgia, where the court decisions around the prosecutors, messing up, have basically made that impossible to prosecute. And then we've got that Supreme Court decision earlier this year that ruled that the president cannot be charged for criminal offenses if they are official acts. So Trump can do what he wants, even if it's a crime, and get away with it. So we're now formally back to where we were before the American Revolution, when we had a revolution against King George III because he was a dictator. And what we wanted was a nation of laws under which all of us, including the president, have to live and be held accountable to. So those are bad developments. But let's look at some good developments. I think the most dramatic in recent weeks has been the Syrian revolution. The Syrian regime around the family dynasty of Bashar al-Assad just collapsed. These drafty soldiers who are underpaid and really not enthusiastic about shooting at their own people just disappeared. They dissolved when the opposition forces started moving toward Damascus via Aleppo, Hama, and Homs. And, we're finding out that the number of people that were tortured, killed, and disappeared may approach 300,000. The human rights organizations had identified about 120,000, but now they're finding so many mass graves that some of the estimates are up to 300,000. I mean, it was a brutal regime. And as we talked with Nidal Batari a couple of weeks ago, the people are really happy about this. They haven't resolved all their political differences, but there's reason to hope, as Nidal talked about, that they can come up with an inclusive democratic government. I think the key thing we need to watch and can have an influence on is the Kurdish question, because Turkey is attacking the Kurds. It wants to destroy the self-governed Kurdish region in the northeast. Turkey sees it as a threat. The Kurds are like the way they mobilize Turkish nationalism for elections. So the Kurds are seen as an enemy. There are a lot of Kurds in Turkey in the southeast of the region. That spills over into Syria, Iraq, and Iran. And so the thing I think we can do is make sure that the U.S. policy is demand that Turkey stop its attacks and allow the Kurds to be included in a democratic dispensation for Syria. So the U.S. has influence there, and it should use it, and we should demand that they use it, which is going to be tough under Trump. Remember, he wanted to just withdraw all the U.S. forces that were helping the Kurds fight ISIS, and the military slow-walked that, so they weren't all withdrawn, but that's something to watch and be aware of. Another thing, and one of the things about this year is the uprisings of people against oppression. So in Georgia, mass upheavals, 200,000, 250,000 people on the street every night against a rigged election, the decision of the Georgia Dream Party of billionaire Benisa Ivanishvili. Those Georgian names are tough for me. Ivanishvili, to increase political repression and move the country into the Russian camp, when 80% of the people, according to many polls, want to be part of the European Union. And that's not because they all love European Union economic policies, but they want to have access to those labor markets, because Ukraine is very poor, and a lot of people go into Europe to work and send remittances back to their families, just like Mexicans do in the United States. So that's a big reason why they want to be part of the European Union. But the people are rising up, and this is a massive uprising, and it bears watching and seeing how it develops. Another uprising was in South Korea, where the right-wing president declared martial law, and the people said, hell no. And they rose up across the political spectrum and said, we want to stay a democracy, and now they've impeached this president. So, the people are not powerless. And then I think another thing to just admire, as Dennis Bondar said last week, he admired Ukrainians' resilience. And there's a narrative that Ukraine is losing the war and Russia's moving fast. In the last year, where they have gained some ground, it's only been 1% of Ukraine's total territory. So, let's not get carried away with that narrative. Although Ukraine does have challenges, both in terms of manpower and, the staff, particularly the frontline infantry, as well as financial challenges and getting the weapons they need. And so I don't know what we put in the chat, because there are a bunch of articles that were relevant. Let me look at the chat and see what's been put up. Okay, we got the billionaires, Trump's billionaires, and we got the apartheid. We got the apartheid, yeah, in the Trump administration, those tech bros. And now we got this interview with the Georgians, who are lefties, about this current uprising. It's very recent, about a week old, and I urge you to read that to understand, what people are rising up for, and also that as particularly Lila Rekviashvili says, it's wrong to frame this as a choice between Russia and the EU. It's more about what independent development do Georgians want and can they get, so they can play off the imperialists in both camps. And so I think that's worth reading. And then on the Ukraine war, there was an article in Jacobin yesterday called Ukraine, a Late Capitalist War Effort, which I think is very enlightening as to the limitations, the problems of both Russia and Ukraine and how they're conducting this war. It's a neoliberal war, not the kind of wars we had in the 20th century where when countries went to war, they mobilized nationalized defense industries or relevant industries and, planned the war effort. This is being done through the market and charity in Ukraine, and a lot of the same in Russia. And in both cases, the middle class, the credentialed professional middle class, is exempt from fighting. In Ukraine, the excuse is these people pay more taxes and we need those revenues because they have higher salaries. In Russia, it's a political thing, and the burden of the war is being fought by national minorities from Asia and Siberia and the Caucasus rather than ethnic Russians, particularly the middle class ethnic Russians in the urban areas of Petersburg and Moscow. So I think that's really an article worth reading to understand how we fight wars in the neoliberal era and the problems with that. The one thing I wish that article had included was the criticism of that from the left in Ukraine. The Sotsialny Ruch, or social movement people I talked to, have been very critical and have been saying we need to nationalize key industries, plan the war effort, and we need new elections so the left and labor can get a foothold in the national parliament and affect these debates. And while we're on Ukraine, there's one more thing let's post, and that is the Ukraine Solidarity Network is raising funds with the railway and miners unions in Ukraine for generators, because people are without power and heat in a lot of places because of this relentless Russian assault on the energy infrastructure. So I hope you'll take a look at that. The donations are tax deductible. It's getting near the end of the year, so if you are in a position where you can take a tax deduction, it'd be a good time to do it now. So we got all that posted. And so the last thing I'll say about Ukraine, with all this talk and negotiation, and Trump saying he wants to resolve it in the first day on Inauguration Day, that's not going to happen. But his appointee to focus on Ukraine, whose name is escaping me at the moment, has basically said, and this is probably the decision Trump's going to have to make, is that if Russia's not willing to compromise, the U.S. is going to back Ukraine even more than it has. But if Russia's willing to compromise, the U.S. is going to use its leverage over Ukraine in terms of supplying weapons and finances to push Ukraine to an agreement. And what that agreement is, I mean, the Ukrainians have to decide for themselves in the end. I don't think the negotiations are possible. You know, the Ukrainians want their land back. Russia wants their land. And Zelensky has offered a compromise. He said, okay, let's leave the Donbass and Crimea to diplomacy in the future and stop the war now and, you know, start to rebuild. But then there are a lot of questions as, you know, Russia wants to limit the strength of the Ukrainian military force. Ukraine says, no, we needed to defend ourselves from another Russian invasion. And Ukraine is insisting on security guarantees. If it's not NATO, then some Western countries, including the U.S. So those are very sticky points. So I don't think they're going to probably come to an agreement. Meanwhile, both countries seem to be running out of resources and gas. Russia's economy, there's a lot of analysis that says by next year into 2025, they're just going to, you know, have lost too much hardware and troops to continue the aggression that they have. And of course, Ukraine is facing the same problems of finances, weapons, and people to fight on the front line. So I think, you know, that's the decision Trump's going to have to make. And either way, as Dennis Bondar said on his podcast last week, Ukraine is going to resist Russia's aggression. So I'm afraid this is going to drag on. So then the question is, okay, you know, they're bad developments, they're good developments. What should we be doing, particularly in the Green Party or independent leftists more generally? And I would argue first that we cannot count on street protests and lobbying alone. They are important, particularly for public education, if they're done right on the issues. But the Republicans could care less that we're out on the street. I mean, all they want to do is, you know, call out the police, even the military in Trump's case, and bust our heads open. The Democrats, who will sometimes give us lip service for some of these issues, feel little pressure to do anything about them because they know they can take progressive votes to their left for granted because there's not a strong independent party of the left. And I will argue that we cannot have that party until we build our base. It's not going to be called forth by celebrities. It's not going to be called forth by street protests alone. It has to be built from the bottom up, community by community, through systematic organizing in those communities. And, you know, we spent a lot of time on the presidential race. There are reasons to run it, ballot access, recruiting new people, you know, getting our issues out to some extent, although the mass media pretty much ignored us, as they always do. But we need to build a base. And instead of electing, you know, right now about 170, I think, Greens in local office, we should have thousands. We should be electing thousands in the next few years. There are 500,000 local offices in the United States, and the Greens and the left should be in a lot more of them, thousands of them. And then by building that foundation and strong local parties that can elect members to local office, that's the foundation for electing people in local races, or larger districts, but local races for state legislatures and the House of Representatives. And I think every local Green Party should develop a plan to take power in their community or their county. And that means, you know, what offices do you target and to get a foothold? And then what do you have to do to actually get power? You know, generally in a urban area encompassed by a county, to get control of that county, you're probably going to need the urban area and the inner ring suburbs, which are more working class. But you got to, do that study of your own community. And as part of that plan, we can begin winning offices in the state legislature, and in some cases, the House district. I mean, that's where we should really aim at, because that's where we can have leverage on national policy. Presidential races or running for Senate in huge states is the money's too big and the media's disinterested unless we're polling highest and raising lots of money. So, but we can do it as a local race in a House district. I think we have the capacity to do that from our stronger locals. And we may not win at first, but we can define the issues. I've had that experience here in Syracuse with, $10 or $15,000 in a good candidate. We got 6 to 8% of the vote, but we defined the issues. In fact, the only time a Democrat won against the Republicans in 75 years was the 2 times the Greens ran. We didn't split the vote. We changed the election. We changed the debate and forced the Democrat to speak more to more progressive issues, which enthused the Democratic base, and they got a higher vote and beat the Republican. So we can have that kind of influence even before we're electing people to the House. And, when we do get a caucus in the House, then we will have leverage. Then the Democrats are going to have to come to the Greens in the House and give something to get votes on legislation. So, and also they'll have a platform that the mass media cannot ignore. So I think that needs to be what our goal, how we're going to get the power to influence national policy. And this should not be about the Greens being, powerless, speaking truth to power. Like I said, the Republicans don't care and the Democrats don't feel threatened by that. We got to be about getting some power to act on the truth. And that's a different thing. It's got to be about getting power. So that starts by building strong local Green parties that are central to the politics of our cities and towns and counties, where we're electing thousands of Greens to local office in the coming period. And from there, going to the state legislature and hopefully the House. And in the Trump years, that's what I think we need to be emphasizing, building that base. So when we pass into the next presidential cycle, we're much more of a force to be reckoned with. So I'll leave you with that thought, and looking forward to see what your comments and questions are on this year that we just finished and what we should be doing next. Scout Trooper 164, I heard this a few times from Kyle Kulinski, that a major reason politics these days are the way they are is thanks to the Supreme Court allowing big money into elections since the 70s. That's a big part of it. I mean, big money always played a role. What happened in the 70s was we began, this was after Watergate, began to require candidates to report their finances to the Federal Election Commission. And then in decisions since then, famous decisions like Citizens United in 2010, the floodgates have opened so that money, we call it dark money, can go to 501c4s and 527 organizations. Those are IRS categories that don't have to report on their donors and can spend as much money as they want. It just has to be nominally independent of the candidates. But, with a wink and a nod and maybe some secret communications, they spend to promote those candidates. So now, big money plays an even bigger role than it ever has, although it always played a big role. I mean, you can go back to, the 1890s, the race in 1896, where, the corporate money came in big time, mostly to block William Jennings Bryan, who was the fusion candidate of the Democratic and People's Party, but also there was silver mining interest behind William Jennings Bryan. So, corporate politics played a big role. And then in the Gilded Age, preceding that and going through that period, the big money was bribing people in the lobbies of state legislatures. It was pretty corrupt. So that's always been the truth. So I think actually money is a problem, but the bigger problem is our single member district winner take all election system, which generates a two-party system and makes third parties that challenge the two-party duopoly look like spoilers. And it's a real impediment. So I think the top priority for us in terms of electoral reform should be winning ranked choice voting for executive offices and proportional ranked choice voting for legislative councils and legislatures, which creates proportional representation. And that eliminates the spoiler problem. And it gives third parties their fair and proportional share of representation and power in government. That will make a big difference. Money will still be a problem that can be dealt with in other ways, like full public campaign financing. Elections are a public function. Why don't we just, have the government pay for them and all the candidates get an equal grant and they can use it as they want and, level the playing field between the candidates for the voters. Janelle, is it possible that the financial gutting of the middle class, perhaps worldwide, is to force us into fighting their wars in order to meet basic necessities through serving in the military? I think the primary motivation for taking away the mobility and economic security of middle class people, and that I assume here means middle income people, which would be working class people with the better jobs and lower middle class people, supervisors and middle managers and small business people and people like that. They're being pressured because the people on top of them, the capitalists, want more of the money they're making. And they don't want to pay taxes either. So the public services that support the middle class are being cut, and the taxes that the rich should pay to pay for those services are being cut. And then the concentration of wealth and monopolization or oligarchization of markets really squeezes the middle class. So I think that's the primary motivation for making life hard for middle income, middling class people. In terms of fighting the wars, it's more the working class, the people further down the economic ladder who end up fighting the wars to meet basic necessities. And as I described, that article in Jacobin describes it for both Ukraine and Russia. That's policy. And it's also, I think, policy because the credentialed middle class and the upper class, the oligarchs or whatever you want to call them, have more political power. So they can force the working class to fight their wars for them. But I don't think, gutting the middle class financially was really done with the idea that then they can go fight our wars for us. It's more like when we got to fight a war, we're going to make the working class fight it. And they already are squeezed. So I think it's the squeeze on the middle classes of the rich and the policies that go with that is what's hurting the middle class. George Johnson Hamilton, green banking and monetary reform. Well, what the Green Party platform calls for is basically an updated version of the Greenback proposal of the Greenback Labor Party and People's Party, the populist movement in the late 19th century. And what they want to do is have money become a public utility instead of something created by extending credit by private banks primarily. And so the government would spend money into the economy without having to borrow it from the bond markets. And that would reduce the deficit. It would provide enough money for commerce, but hopefully not too much so that it creates inflation. And it makes the money supply and the policies that supply is supposed to promote the object of democratic control. And that's a policy of the Green Party in the United States and the Green Party of England and Wales. And I was looking on their website because, they have a policy page. It's kind of like the Green Party platform in the US, or a policy document. It is all the policies they've adopted. And then they issue election manifestos which highlight what they're running on in that election. So what they did recently was take that policy book, or whatever you want to call it, off the publicly available website. So one of my questions when I talk to the Greens in England and Wales is, did you repeal those policies or where are they? And they said, no, they're there. You have to be a paid up member to get access to them on their website. So it's not as public. But I looked at, I was with a member who opened it up for me and saw that the policies they have are what they had before. And actually, I think their drafting, their language is clearer than it is in the U.S. Green Party platform. So I favor that. I think that would democratize the money question and take it out of the hands of the private banks, and which can lead to economic stability, because in boom times they extend too much credit, and then when things tighten up, you have defaults, and then the economy goes down and bankruptcies. You can have a more steady money supply that is sufficient for the needs of commerce if it's publicly issued. And then the only problem is the public officials we elect smart enough to do it right, which is always a problem in democracy. But democracy is the best option we got, because at least then we have a say. So I support that. So I hope that answers your question. George Johnson Hamilton. How does the intentional destabilization of global financial systems by cryptocurrencies going to raise the third world? It's not. I mean, we've got big debt bubbles. The debt of the global south is proportionally greater than it's ever been. And they don't have the capacity to build their economies to the point where they can pay all that off. There's going to have to be debt relief. It's either going to be organized and systematic, and lenders are going to take haircuts, or it's going to be chaotic with countries declaring they can't pay their debts and refusing to pay. And then that's going to cause bankruptcies in some cases in the global north as well. Now, cryptocurrencies is a total financial bubble. They don't represent anything but people's speculation about what other people think they're going to be worth going forward. And they've risen to, stratospheric levels. And it just seems to me a matter of time before they're going to collapse. And a lot of people are going to lose a lot of money. El Salvador makes cryptocurrency part of their monetary system, which I think is going to not pay them off in the end. So I think this is something that needs to be regulated so that it doesn't upset the global financial systems, and we end up it ends up being part of a debt collapse, which can lead to deflation and a real depression. Joanna Munley, I enjoyed your recent interview with a British Green MP. What can the Greens in the U.S. learn from British Greens? Thanks. Yeah, it was Ismail Hamdosh was his name, I think. I met so many people. I hope I got his name right. He's not a member of the MP. He's not a British MP. The Greens do have 4 in England, in the United Kingdom. But he's a borough councillor. So in London, they have the Greater London Assembly, which is the city council for the whole metro area, and then they break it down into boroughs, and they have their own councils. So this guy, I'm remembering his last name, and I had trouble pronouncing it. I'm forgetting what his first name was. It's an Arab name, but anyway, he's played a big role in getting the Greens better organized. Now, his district, I went out with him canvassing in what they call council housing, which is municipal public housing in the UK. And, we were knocking on doors, and, he was touching base with people. And as you would expect, some people say, I got no problems. Thanks for stopping by. Other people do say, well, can you help me with this or that? And it was interesting as we were walking between these council houses, a woman came running up to him and said, oh, thank you so much for this, problem you solved for me, which shows that kind of, canvassing systematic, which they do. That's one thing we need to learn. They systematically are canvassing their election districts. Now, this district was a left labor stronghold. It's actually the constituency for the member of parliament, Jeremy Corbyn. And Labor kicked him out, but he got reelected as an independent. And across the street, which partly includes Hamdosh's district, is Diane Abbott, another progressive member of the Labor Party. So this is a left-leaning district, but the Greens are electing people to the offices below Parliament and building that base. So one thing they're doing is doing that canvassing. They're active on issues between elections. So they don't just show up and say, elect us because we stand for this, that, and the other thing. They're actually doing something about it between elections, at demonstrations and public meetings and public hearings. And they got a real local. The first day I was there, they took me to a local fundraiser where they have this trivia quiz, and everybody was really into it. Apparently it's a British thing. They do it in the bars, and they did it. They had a trivia night, and they had 20 questions that people in each table tried to answer. There's about 75 people there. And, they were there. They got fed. They had, somebody cooking a vegan dinner for them. And so they not only, are online, they're actually meeting face to face and getting to know each other personally, which builds, camaraderie and friendships, and it gives coherence to their local party. And then the other thing they did, which I think we can learn from, is that they picked out constituencies for the parliament, what we would call congressional districts, and they emphasize putting the national party's resources into key districts, and they elected 4 members of parliament. Until this last election, they only had 1. That was Caroline Lucas, who just resigned or retired, and now they got 4 people there. And so I think that's another thing we could learn, is that when you reach for those higher offices, concentrate your limited resources, and you have a good chance of winning them. Now, one thing they are that we are not is they are a membership party. They are a dues-paying membership party. And I forget what the dues are. It's like, God, I can't remember. I got it in my notes somewhere. There were so many parties I talked to and got that information, but it's something like $10 a month, $15 a month. And they have a waiver for people that are, in economic hardship. And it raises them a good, core budget. And then they raise more money by, like, the fundraiser I was at, and then they ask for campaign contributions when elections come around. So they have, they have staff. They have somebody who, is coordinating the canvassing in these borough districts in London. They have national staff. So that's what we don't have in the United States in need. So, I would say they emphasize locally, building from below. They raise money by dues, so they have, a core budget. And when they do go for the higher office, they pool their resources. And I think those are all things we could learn. BL, what is the Green Party doing to grow and attract new members? Well, I think we're debating that right now. As I mentioned, Jill Stein and the steering committee has agreed to do this national campaign around Palestine and Ukraine. I don't think that's what we should be emphasizing. I think we really need to go back to the base. When we started in the 80s and 90s, we weren't, like Jill's going to a little conference with Workers' Strike Back with Shama Sawant and Chris Hedges. We're not going to build a movement by, having meetings with minor personalities or celebrities, it's not going to attract that many people. What we got to do is go to communities. What we did in the 80s and 90s is we started organizing local groups. And then we would come together every year for a National Green Gathering where we would share experiences and begin to work on a national policy platform. And we did that, through the 80s and 90s, so that by the time Ralph Nader said we could use his name on presidential ballots in 96, we had the base to get on 23 ballots. And then he ran full time in 2000, and we got on 46 state ballots, the most we have ever got on. But that would not have been possible if we hadn't built the base. So I think we got to go back to our roots there. The Trump years are going to be hard to influence the federal government. Right now, the Republicans got control of the House, Senate, presidency, and Supreme Court. And, we should be out there protesting. Like I said, it has more to do with moving the public to our positions than moving the government. That's part of it. But we need to be building a base that can take power, get a foothold in local government, and from that foundation, then get to the state governments and eventually the House of Representatives. And in state governments, there's a lot we can do to resist Trump policies, institute policies like we got a housing crisis. I just saw a headline, we got record homelessness in Syracuse, which is true in a lot of communities. So what are we doing about it? Our city government ain't doing nothing. But I think the Greens should advocate we need a municipal public housing program or social housing program to start building affordable housing. We can do that, get more affordable units built than by providing subsidies to private developers. So public housing should be part of our program, as well as rent control. We can do rent control. It's not, nobody in the Democrats that run the city is talking about that, but that is an emergency measure so that people aren't thrown out as rents escalate, which they are in Syracuse now because there's a big micron, microchip plant being built. So there's going to be a lot of economic activities that is going to squeeze housing and raise rents. And a lot of these people are coming in from outside. They're technical and credentialed workers. They can't be recruited locally because our working class is not that educated, working service jobs and custodial jobs and home care jobs. They're just not going to get into that micron plant, which is going to employ thousands and thousands. So we need a program here. So that's the kind of thing, just one example of the kind of things we can do locally, make it an issue, make it a debate, run candidates on it. And I think we can win some of these issues because it's going to have support. People want a real program for housing, not just, an announcement that we got a little grant from the state to, subsidize some developers to build some affordable housing or some affordable units in a luxury development. We need, a serious program. And that's what the Green Party should be for. And we can do that at the local level, whatever Trump does. I mean, he's going to be very repressive, and he's going to go after progressive nonprofits. He's going to weaponize the Justice Department to go after politicians and media critics. And that's going to be terrible. The deportations and, the news today is he's got a whole bunch of executive orders ready to go on immigration when the day he gets inaugurated. It's going to be rough. But that doesn't mean we can't move forward locally and get a foothold in government and use that as a platform that, when we're in local government, we're legitimate. We got a platform to speak to the media. And we're telling the public, hey, we're serious. We are good at this. And therefore, when we run for state legislature or the House, you should take a good look at us. So I think that's what we need to do to grow and attract new members. We got to build local parties that are serious, as I said, about getting power, not just showing the flag and, making a statement. Violet Content Boutique. Trump intends to deport protesters who can afford to make their way back home. If that's possible, or is that possible? Maybe that's what you're asking. Yeah, I mean, we've done it before. We deported a lot of people who immigrated from Russia, like Emma Goldberg and Alexander Berkman, the famous anarchists, members of the Socialist Party during dissenting against World War I. So that's been done. And yeah, it's exactly the kind of thing Trump wants to do. I'm more worried because I think a lot of domestic protesters are not immigrants. They are, U.S. citizens, native-born citizens. He wants to break heads. He wants to get rough. He wants to encourage sheriff's departments and police departments to get rough, and also maybe call in the military when there's bigger protests and urge them to get rough, violent. That's what I mean by rough. That's what Trump wants to do. So that's, something we're going to have to deal with as well. And I think that's really important why, in this case, nonviolence on our part is important. And we have, factions of street movements that want to, break windows and graffiti and, chase the cops back and forth across the street. That's not productive. We're speaking to the public in these demonstrations, and they don't want to see that crap. They want to see, people being peaceful and making a clear statement about what they want. I remember a demonstration against the Vietnam War in Washington, D.C., 1971. And it was on the lawn of the Capitol, that slopes down, and the lawn was full of protesters, great speeches from the podium. And then on the street back between the lawn and the mall going to the Washington Monument and to the Lincoln Monument beyond that, there was a line of cops and a line of kids, basically teenagers that were playing hide and seek. They'd run up at the cops and throw a rock and run away, and the cops would run after them. And they were back and forth across the street. And that's not what the protest was about. But what you read, even in the Washington Post the next day, was all about the shenanigans, this sideshow on the street, and not what the demonstration was about and what the speakers were saying. And that's the kind of thing we can't. And, the repressive apparatus of the state, they'll put agent provocateurs in our movements to encourage that activity. So then they have the excuse to break heads. And so we got to be, conscious of that when we organize protests, and be smart. Scout Trooper 164. Howie, with the killing of Brian Thompson, do you believe that we may be entering a second Gilded Age or not? I thought about this, but I'm not sure. Well, I guess you're referring to assassinations in the Gilded Age. That like around the turn of the century. I mentioned Alexander Berkman. He tried to kill Ford Fricka, who ran a steel plant, I believe, in Pittsburgh. McKinley was assassinated by an anarchist. And so if that's what you're referring to, I hope not, because those violent acts just give the state the excuse to crack down on all of us, even those of us that are nonviolent, and we don't want that. When I think of the second Gilded Age, I think of the concentration of wealth. I mean, we are now, according to Gabriel Zuckman, who's a economist at Berkeley, he just got the MacArthur Genius Award. He studied distribution of income and wealth, through time. And he said, this was in 2021, that we are now more unequal than we were during the Gilded Age, when the robber barons of the late 19th century and early 20th century, really had all the wealth. And now our super rich have even a higher concentration of wealth. That's what I think of as the second Gilded Age. I think the main difference between then and now so far is that during the Gilded Age, which was named by Mark Twain, and it refers to the period after the Civil War, really up until World War I, where the robber barons and big corporations came to power and concentrated wealth in the economy. And then there was resistance. There was the populist movement and the socialist movement, late 18th century, 19th century, populist movement, early 20th century, socialist movement. A lot of the same people were populists, became socialists, like Eugene Debs. And they were fighting back, and they had an alternative program. I don't see that now. I mean, the Greens were tiny compared to those parties. They elected thousands of people to local state office and the House of Representatives, the Greenback Labor Party, the People's Party, the Socialist Party. We haven't done that, and we've been at it since '84. And I'm not saying it's all our fault. The broader left in this country went into the Democratic Party in the '30s. The communists called for a popular front. Labor went in with them. And most of the left, who consider themselves socialists, they worked for New Deal Democrats, mild social Democrats, from the '30s to the early '70s. And then the Democrats became the neoliberal corporate New Democrats. And the socialist left is still mostly supporting Democrats. And they've disappeared as a distinct movement with its own identity and policy program, analysis of capitalism, and a political party. I mean, so it's co-opted by the Democratic Party, and whatever socialist politics some people doing that have really doesn't get expressed in the public sphere. That's why we need the Green Party or an independent party to the left of some kind. And that's a difference from the Gilded Age, because the left brought up their own parties. They didn't try to work within the Democratic or Republican parties. That was seen as crazy, and it still is. But that's what most of the left is doing. So I'm giving the Greens a little bit of an excuse. With all our problems, at least we're smart enough to know that the Democratic Party is a dead end. Since we haven't had a show with just you since you returned from Europe, favorite part, major reflection on your trip? Well, from Eastern Europe, they are just, they're disappointed, kind of finding it hard to believe, and angry that so much of the left in America doesn't see Russia's aggression for what it is, the biggest act of aggression since Hitler invaded Poland that started World War II. And they're just flabbergasted that we got people on the left here saying, Russia's defending itself from NATO. The only imperialist army in Ukraine is 700 or 800,000 Russian military forces in Ukraine. It's not NATO. So they just can't believe. And they look at us as, privileged pacifists sitting across the ocean. It doesn't affect us personally. And we're too ignorant to understand what's going on. That really, the left, the Greens in East Europe, that's how they look at us. And, they did appreciate, the positions I've taken, the fact that I went there and talked to them. But they look at, it's not just the Green Party. It's DSA and PSL and bunch of these podcasters who call themselves on the left and they take right-wing positions with Putin. They're just, they just can't believe it. They think, and they also say that hurts the left in East Europe because the remnants of the Communist Party of Russia, of the Soviet Union, support Putin. So they see a left that, is either apologizing or supporting Putin as a part of the system that they want to get beyond. They don't want to go back to Stalinism and its repression, and they don't want to go into neoliberal capitalism. They want a democratic socialism. They want a third way that's in neither camp. And their ability to do that kind of organizing is hurt by when the Western left supports the Russians or apologizes for them. So that's Eastern Europe. Western Europe, where I talked to more Greens, I did talk to people on the far left too. Their big concern is the rise of the far right, and they see Trump's election as a real defeat and a real boost to the far right in Europe. And Putin, who is sort of the spiritual leader and, supporting far right parties in Europe, like the Alternative for Deutschland in Germany and Marine Le Pen's National Rally in France and so forth. And so they are trying to figure out how they fight the right, how they build an anti-fascist movement. And you hear some people in the Greens here say, the Greens in Europe are right wing. And one guy wrote that in some column that they're neo-Nazis because they, support Israel's genocide in Gaza. That's more subtle in the case of the German Greens, although their position could improve. In fact, one of the debates at the European Green Federations on resolutions was the resolution on Gaza, which is a good resolution. They want Israel to stop killing everybody, but the Germans were trying to water down or nuance the language, and it was irritating most of the other delegations. The Germans said, we got to deal with a domestic audience that is still very guilty about the Holocaust. So, they negotiated that and adopted a resolution. Most people were satisfied in the end. But that was one side debate. But the main debate was, how do we build this anti-fascist movement? And what they were saying was, we cannot back down to the right, which scapegoats us for our climate actions. The right says, climate policy is creating inflation and taking jobs and all this other nonsense. And they said, we can't back down on that, but we've got to emphasize more the social in their social and green and social deal for Europe, which was the slogan of the Greens in Europe in their last parliamentary election, European parliamentary election. And in this conference, they had the slogan up on the screen, on the background on the walls, a green, social, and democratic Europe, because the authoritarian fascists are on the rise. So what impressed me was that, the Greens in Europe, they are progressive. They understand that, maybe they compromise too much with the Social Democrats and some of the neoliberal market reforms and cuts to social safety net and protections for labor. They called it flexible labor markets. The capitalists pushed that hard, and the Greens, as part of coalitions, went along with that, and they're having second thoughts about that. So, my impression was, the Greens are, and they're also serious. I mean, the Greens are deep thinkers in Europe, and I have to say deeper than we are in America. And they're dealing from positions in parliaments, in government, and they have to, make difficult decisions when they're in these coalitions. And so, like the Irish Greens, who got wiped out in the election right before the European Greens Congress, they lost 11 of 12 seats in the parliament they had. They were saying, and they had gone into coalition with two center-right parties who won this election where the Greens got wiped out. The Greens were saying, well, at least we kept the far right out, which is one reason. And one reason they went into coalition with the center right. And they also said we were able to get climate policies passed that would not have been passed if we had not been part of the coalition. So, that's the way one side looks at it. I know the Greens in England and Wales were saying, these Greens in Ireland and Austria who have gone into coalition with center-right parties are a problem because we want to be an anti-capitalist, eco-socialist Green Party. So that's what the English Greens are saying. But those are good debates to have when you're actually in a position to wield some power and have to make decisions. So overall, I was impressed by the Greens in Western Europe. And so I'll leave it there. There's a lot more. I'm writing up reports. I wrote up about 10 in the first 10 days, and then it just got too busy. And I'm just starting to catch up now. But I probably have 15 or more reports of people I interviewed and meetings I went to and demonstrations I went to. And that'll be in New Green Horizons and also on my website. Well, I don't know about you, but that hour went up quickly, and I see a lot of people asking questions in the chat. We didn't get to all of them, but we like to limit this to an hour, so it isn't a big commitment, but a commitment that you can consistently make. So we'll be back next week. I'm half thinking of inviting a Georgian to update us on what's going on in Georgia, or maybe we should just continue, with questions and answers and back and forth, because there seems to be a lot of interest in the chat. So if you have a thought about that, put it in the chat. Otherwise, we will be here again next Saturday at 3 p.m. Eastern. And next Saturday is what date? I'm trying to think about holidays. It's next Saturday is what, the 6th already? December 28th. No, it's the 4th. Okay, so it's part of a long New Year's weekend, but we'll be here. And whether it's a guest or just me, we'll continue the conversation. So everybody, have a good week. Happy New Year, and we'll see you again. Bye.